Are they still doing PCR tests?
Yes.
And so this is like your expertise. You're saying these PCR tests are not accurate, not as accurate?
Well, it's not that they're not as accurate. They get trace artifacts, and they basically do a polymerase chain reaction where they actually recreate the COVID particle using the other strand to the base pairing on that RNA. So they can tell if you've had COVID or if your body's reacting and you've got the antibodies, but they don't know if you're actually able to transmit it or not. So
they can't tell viral load. So you could be asymptomatic with a very limited load, and they can't see that.
Bingo.
So they need different tests.
Yeah.
And I think it's really obvious they went to this direction of even if you're vaccinated, you got to get tested. Because I said this a couple weeks ago. How does it make sense that you're going to be like, you can't come to the movies unless you're vaccinated or get weekly tested? And I'm like, breakthrough cases exist, and people who have breakthrough cases can transmit to the same degree as someone with who's not vaccinated. Once you get COVID, your chance of transmission is like equal regardless of vaccination status. But those who are vaccinated are much less likely to get. That's what they're saying. But if that's still the case, they can transmit it. Then doesn't everyone need a test? But they were like, no, and I was like, okay, now here we are. University of Arizona is the first to be like, yeah, everybody get your test.
So do you know, so now that this Delta variant is out, are they still vaccinating for the original variant, even though there's a new variant that's traveling? So when people are getting sick with COVID, are they actually, I put it in quotes, are they getting sick with a variant that the vaccine is not prepared for?
There's all sorts of different variants of, COVID. And the difference is that you can have a variant of COVID that literally does absolutely nothing. Like if you go ahead and you look at the sequencing data on GISAID, you'll see so many different, like on GISAID where they share the actual data from the PCR tests and from like people that they actually confirm positives, they can tell you what prevalence that specific strain is. They've got a bunch of them, and it's a bunch of different areas just sharing that data. So you have variants that do absolutely nothing over the actual version. That's natural because it's an RNA virus. You're going to get, single nucleotide polymorphisms where, again, a code, one of the base pairings skips or one of the base pairings omits and it's not the right one. And so the question is, what does the Delta variant do? Do we even know? Because a lot of people say that it's more transmissible, but you got to think the Delta variant started coming around right as everybody started getting COVID apathy. Lockdowns were being released in a lot of places. They're brushing in. It's like, how do you gauge transmissibility if you're not infecting somebody with COVID, telling them to walk the same distance around the same amount of people, not touch anybody, but get within this distance you can't control to see how transmissible a specific strain is. So do we know that it has any, and this is the hot button, demonstrated gain of function over normal, over the normal SARS-CoV-2 strain? Like, that's the question that you have to actually ask. Nobody.
Like when someone walks in, if something were to happen where like this person got COVID from that person, I've been following this for a while and I don't know, they don't say what strain they caught. So I keep thinking it's the original, but it might not be, right?
Well, so here's what I think happened. And I consult your doctor because I'm not an expert on this, but I was reading about it. And basically when we had the alpha strain, it was like the original strain. It was brutal. It was more deadly, less infectious. But what happens is natural selection occurs, right? So the viruses that cause, and outside of COVID, just in general, and you can probably correct me if I'm wrong on this one, but viruses that cause more damage are less likely to spread because the person notices it and then takes action. So viruses that are less deadly and less, causing of symptoms are more likely to transmit, naturally selecting for a highly transmissible but less deadly variant.
Yeah.
So what happens is, here's what I think. This is my opinion. The alpha variant, I think, was nightmarish. Like the data we were getting, the videos we were seeing, it was horrifying. We saw videos of people collapsing in the street in China. People are now saying they're fake. No, I don't think that's what's happening. I think what happened was the initial strain was people are saying it was like a pressure on their chest. And so you've got people in China who are like pressured to go out work and there's like a more honor culture. So it's like, put a mask on and get out there. And then someone would be struggling to breathe. And what happens when you can't breathe? You pass out.
Yeah, they have bad air there too anyway.
Right. So you got bad air, you've got pressure on the chest, and this weird like pneumonia was going around. So we see this data, and the initial data was like we could see millions die from this in the U.S. Like the New York Times had a slider bar.
Models were horrible.
But what happens is there's a natural selection that occurs. The most severe strains are eliminating themselves by killing people. The less severe variants were more likely to transmit because the people were less likely to be hospitalized. So then we went alpha, we had beta, now we've seen epsilon and mu, but delta seems to be the scarier one. It's highly transmissible and still deadly, but less deadly. Mm-hmm. This really makes sense. So now we're getting to that point perhaps where, people are saying we're gonna have to live with COVID, but the worst strain of COVID will probably fizzle itself out. So I'll throw it back to the 1918 flu pandemic for another point of data. There's one historical theory that the 1918 pandemic started in China as a very as a lighter strain, and a bunch of people got it and they got over it, but then it moved into the trenches, came back to the United States where it festered and got worse. And because it had the ability to rapidly infect close-quartered people who were injured or sick, that allowed for a very serious variant to rapidly infect lots of people. By the time it made it back to China, the people of China already had some natural immunity to a similar strain and were less impacted by it. In this instance, it's similar but different. The very serious strain was struggling because we did the slowdown, we did the lockdowns, we did these things. I think it's fair to say we probably had a positive impact in that regard, but then variants can still persist, and we made a lot of mistakes. Notably, being indoors seems to be bad. Mm-hmm. Being outside with fresh air, with UV lights, with vitamin D, with exercise seems to be good. So we made some mistakes in that capacity. We need to update our strategy. Now I think we're in a new pandemic, a pandemic of political manipulation, where we do have a crisis. Coronavirus is really bad. We're still hearing stories about people getting it, but now you've got political parties that are like, now's our chance. Never let a good crisis go to waste.
Exactly. And I mean, they're doing that. And, part of the issue as well, though, you can actually argue with the lockdowns is that you allow and incentivize mutations when you lock down, because when they finally get out or when they have to actually go out and they've been locked down for so long, they're spreading a much more mutated iteration. It's went through about 5 or 6 viral generations. And now you're getting something that there's always a small chance that when a virus mutates that it can demonstrate a little bit more virulence and it can become a lot more deadly. But
that's interesting. Locking down essentially created isolated incubation.
Yeah.
That's what I'm wondering. Are viruses more or less likely to mutate in isolation?
Isolate pretty much. If we never locked down, what would happen is that COVID would burn through its host reservoir. Eventually we would reach herd immunity a lot faster. That's at least, that's the traditional logic. I think it still stands. There's a lot of inconsistency on it, and I'm not going to give you a definitive, but what happens is you let it burn through its host reservoir, and again, people are going to succumb to the illness. That's part of the nature of it. But once it actually burns through, everybody's already immune, they're immunized. So you don't have let's say a generation 1 COVID and then generation 5, a generation 5 COVID illness going. And then generation 5 is so much different from generation 1 that eventually you get a chance mutation that allows it to spread a little bit easier.
A question, if you don't know the answer, it's okay. If you become immune to like COVID alpha, can it mutate in your system once you develop immunity to the alpha? Can it?
That's always a possibility. That's actually something that, okay. It's complicated because once you have the antibodies, once you have the immunoglobulin G antibodies within your blood, once it's there, again, it's going to eventually get wiped. It's going to eventually get wiped out, and then the rest of your antibody production will catch on. Lymphocytes and the dendritic cells will begin to dispose of it. So you will eventually get rid of the infection entirely. But the issue is, again, how do you control for whatever you're spreading? Because you have 1,000 different variants of the virus here, and the one that's the most transmissible will then be able to be shed to somebody else, and then that one will actually spread, and it'll copy those it'll actually carry those same transmissibility traits, and it might actually improve on that further and further and further, and then they might actually spread that one. But it's all chance. It's like you're rolling a dice every single time, because first you have to actually spread the most transmissible variant of it, and then you have to hope that one doesn't self-terminate or snuff itself out every single time that it's hijacking a cell and getting itself to be reproduced. If it snuffs itself out, or if you don't actually spread it and your body actually develops immunity to it, that's game over. So it's basically a chance thing. That's why I say mutations they're drummed up to such a degree that, it's like Tim said, they're not letting a good crisis go to waste, but really this is something mundane that we're making sound so exotic.
I think initially I actually do think the initial, like everything we saw initially was accurate. And we have to make sure we're updating the science as the mutations happen and assess our economic circumstances. It started with a novel virus it was highly infectious and it was novel, so it was likely going to hit everybody. And it was just, as they reported, not a lab leak, but just very interestingly, it had these proper, infection methods. But in the beginning, they're like, look, nobody's had this, so that means everyone's going to get it. There's no natural immunity to this. And that means we're going to see a lot of death. And so we wanted to do something about it. I think that was legitimate. But what happens is, with mutations, with bad policy, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. We should have done different things. I can accept that. Trump should have fired Fauci. I definitely think that is. Fauci has got no confidence from the American people. Mm-hmm. But it's hard to say. We're at a point now where I'm wondering if the hard lockdowns allowed for isolated incubation. So put it this way. If the population is rapidly intermingling, then there will be variants, but people will quickly catch certain strains and then develop immunity to those strains. Granted, with a novel virus, we're talking about a lot of death, so it's a scary, it's scary to just be like, we're going to ignore this. Well, then you get overloaded hospitals. Yeah. But if you tell everyone to lock down, then what happens is, let's say you have 10 buildings that are sealed, each each are infected with COVID. When they open the doors, you could have 10 variants because they've went through multiple, like you said, 5 or 6 generations. Mm-hmm. Now it comes out with 10 different strains all at once. Yeah. So, look, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this or an expert on policy.
Nobody is at this point.
Right. It's hard to know for sure. The one thing I can say is when you look at Australia, you look at what's happening with Democrats, I think they're like, it's an opportunity for us to push through agenda items to do a lot of things. Now, interestingly, I guess, Gretchen Whitmer, like, is opposing vax mandates and mask mandates. Her polling was bad or something like that.
She must have saw them numbers.
All right. She's for the people.
Well, I'm glad that's the case, but I don't think it's going to save her career. Mm-hmm. I think too many Democrats saw this as an opportunity. They started by saying, come on down to Chinatown. That's what Nancy Pelosi was saying.
I remember that.
Nancy Pelosi not wearing a mask, getting her hair done. Gavin Newsom not wearing a mask, going to these restaurants. They don't care about this. And I'll tell you this, celebrities aren't scared of this at all.
No.
Take into consideration that. They go to the Emmys, they go to the Met Gala, they don't wear masks, they don't care. They literally do not fear this at all. So if you're sitting at home and you're worried and you're scared about this, ask yourself why it is that political elites and celebrities have zero fear. They go on TV, they don't wear masks, they go to special events, they don't wear masks, they do not care about this.
Mm-hmm. There's just such an informational lag because I think conservatives are on the cutting edge of this. Conservatives have already gotten to the point where we've accepted that this is going to be an endemic virus. It's not as bad as it could be. Practice good health, get outside, again, because you need the vitamin D, and also because heat stimulates interferons, which can help your body actually ward off the virus. A lot of people don't do research into interferons. Yeah, children also have a much higher number of interferons within their nose, and that's part of the reason why children are less susceptible in general.
Wow.
But, there's so many facets to this that the average person does not know. And there's an informational lag because they're getting it from these traditional sources. So what do? You
Make more interferons, baby. Hey, So you're saying it's endemic, which means, what does that mean exactly?
That means that it's basically a part of society. You're going to have a COVID flu every single year.
Flu season.
And ask yourself, how long have we had a flu vaccine?
Oh, we've got a bunch of different ones.
Okay. Have we gotten rid of the flu yet?
No. Nope.
Okay. So why are we trying to do the same thing with COVID?
Right. But I always call it the flu shot. Is that because I thought it wasn't a vaccine?
It is a vaccine.
Well, it's a more traditional one. The mRNA vaccine is where you're exposing yourself to 2 specific spike proteins out of the 26 that are on the surface of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. But these have what's called a pre-fusion conformation, which keeps the spike protein from damaging the cell, basically as it's as it's manufactured, and it actually locks it onto your cell, the plasma membrane of a cell, so it can't get loose and go and damage other cells.
This is the RNA one?
That's the RNA. It helps your body basically produce the spike protein so that you can create those IgG, Jesus Christ, antibodies. That's the worst naming convention
I'm
ever.
So glad you're here.
It's
complicated.
It's super complicated, but it's also niche too, because again, a lot of virologists, they'll study this and they won't put 2 and 2 together. And then, you have some virologists that dedicate themselves to studying interferons. You have some that dedicate themselves to studying different methods to deploy, vaccines. That's pretty much how we have the 8026 in the Janssen, and that's how we have the nanoparticle, the lipid covered nanoparticle of basically the Pfizer one. And
So what's a traditional vaccine called? Does it have a name?
I would say a live, well, no, it wouldn't be the live attenuated one.
Right.
Yeah, that's pretty much it, where you're presenting an inert copy.
So the Novavax, I think. That's one. That's a traditional vaccine. Is that a live attenuated or?
Ooh, I might actually have to go look at that. The specifics of which I'm super.
Do you know anything about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Yes.
It's a DNA virus. It's a DNA vaccine, right?
I think it's still I thought it was still RNA, but it was just deployed using a adenovirus that was actually found in rhesus monkeys. I could be wrong, but I thought that we're still dealing with RNA.
Hey, kind of as a more general question, do you think that there's a lot of promise in the RNA vaccines in general?
I mean, it's a useful way to do what we've always done, but the weakness of the RNA vaccines is, again, it's bloodborne immunity, which means if you have something that transmits or sheds via the nose, you're still able to transmit, because that's a different antibody that you're trying to produce.
So it works on blood, but not in mucus, not in lymph.
Yeah, those would be the IgA antibodies that you find there, your saliva, and I believe in your stomach.
It says DNA. It says that Johnson & Johnson uses an adenovirus to deliver the spike protein DNA. And it's Nebraska medicine, so I'm assuming that I read this too. I think I was reading on the CDC that it's a DNA vaccine versus the mRNA vaccine. Similar but different technologies.
Yeah, it's just the same process, just kind of in reverse. DNA, you're basically cleaving it into an RNA. You're basically splitting it into an RNA and then giving it out to your ribosome so that they can actually, send it. So they can actually manufacture it. Where it's RNA, again, it's already ready to go.
Word.
It's like inserting a disc with a program into a computer.
So before we move on,
like a Doom CD-ROM.
Yeah, indeed.
Yes, a very
Before we
old
move
one.
on, I have to ask. A lot of times people will just dismiss out of hand the concept of a vaccine altogether because they'll tell me it's not a vaccine, it's gene therapy. What do you say to that?
I mean, it's a semantic argument because, everything is, everything to some degree are genes. Like, now what I think when people say gene therapy, they're thinking kind of like a retrovirus where it actually overwrites the DNA of your cells and causes them to basically by default produce this. Like I said, this is like just inserting a CD into a computer and telling it run a specific program. It's going to conduct that.
I was reading a Harvard article about gene therapy. A lot of people were saying, see, it proves mRNA is gene therapy. It actually doesn't. The Harvard article says that there is mRNA gene therapy. mRNA vaccines are not gene therapy. So the idea is basically what they're saying. If you've got a genetic disorder, they can use mRNA to literally do a gene therapy and change the DNA in your cells to stop that disorder. But these vaccines don't do that.
Right.
They just give the RNA to make a spike protein and then eventually cease to exist.
They allow the ribosomes to basically go to work and, again, mobilize the aminos to conduct the protein. And it's only 2 out of the 26 that you'll find on the surface too. So it's not even like it's covering the whole cell with it.
And I just think there's a lot of other arguments people make. They use semantic arguments like gene therapy. I'm like, what does that mean? I mean, does that affect the politics of freedom and medical choice and bodily autonomy?
Fight the mandates, not the vaccines, because again, the vaccines are pretty much wonderful anywhere that you've actually been. Yes, these may have, you might have a lot of allergic reactions. There's a lot that we don't know how people's bodies are reacting to it, but people react. All medicine has risk.
Yeah.
People react oddly to all kinds of medicines depending on what.
I'll put it this way. If someone comes to me and says that they would like to get vaccinated, I'll be like, that's cool. You talk to your doctor and they'll be like, yeah, I'm like, that's fantastic. I'm glad you did that. Thank you. That's awesome. Yeah. I don't think we should force people to do it though. And there's arguments about like, well, what about all the other vaccines? And I'm like, truth be told, I still have issues with government mandated medication. I think people, but there's limited function, right? If you want to go to a public institution like a school and they mandate it, that's different from saying all public accommodation, period, for participation in society. Furthermore, the older vaccines have been around for a much, much longer time and went through a legislative process for approval. It's very different from like, we're in a crisis and we're going to just executive decree this stuff. So I think it's like what the Supreme Court said about the eviction moratorium. It's an issue for Congress. Laws have to be voted on and passed. And the problem is when Democrats realize they can't get it through because of Republicans, they just say, we'll squeeze it in with a budget bill. We'll do the omnibus spending where we just get whatever we want, or Biden will rule by decree.
Yeah, and that goes back to what we said, though, that, again, the Democratic Party is sick. And when you have a sick party that can't get the other wing to agree or work with it, then what do you get? You get these schemes, these plans, these ways that you are trying to control, manipulate, and snuff out the other party. And that eventually destroys the nation, because you need the ideas of the left, which left it doesn't mean de facto communism. Let's go to that. Left and right are just semantic terms that we use to describe traditionalism, which would normally be right. And then, this whole moving forward, changing things, which is what we see left. Like, if America was historically a communist country, the commies would be the right.
Yeah.
And, the left would be the capitalists. And could you imagine that a group of Wall Street bets, savant capitalists hurling Molotov cocktails into worker camps?
Yeah, but they also don't it's not about being establishment. It's just that certain political factions don't engage in that kind of behavior.
Yeah.
Whether they're revolutionary or not. But thanks for checking out this clip from the Timcast IRL podcast. If you want to see the full show, come back to this channel, youtube.com/TimcastIRL, Monday through Friday at 8 p.m., where you can leave comments and super chat, and we actually will read your comments on the show. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and if you want exclusive members-only content, segments you can't get anywhere else, go to timcast.com, become a member, and we even have full bonus episodes. Thanks for hanging out, and we'll see you all next time.